Hey Unwrappers, Olly here with a reminder about our sister podcast, The Overview, from the week. You've heard the headline, but what's the full story? Download The Overview podcast now to discover the past, present and future of an idea or story that's in the news. Each week, the Week team explores how we got to where we are today, asking guest experts what's going to happen next. To get it, just search for The Overview now and press follow to get news stories you'll wish you'd already known about. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 26th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Chancellor Rishi Sunak cutting fuel duty and raising the national insurance threshold, NATO estimating that up to 15,000 Russian troops have lost their lives in the first month of the war in Ukraine, and tributes paid to the first female US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who's died at the age of 84. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, we have Sorcha Bradley from The Week magazine, assistant editor Leif Arbuthnot, and from daily history podcast The Retrospectors, it's a great listen, that co-host Olly Mann is hilarious, it's Arion McNicoll. Arion, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that the expression "as happy as Larry" needs to be updated to "as happy as Lars."
The reason I bring that up today is because we found one of the most concerning trends we've ever seen in the history of our reporting, which is we find that stress, sadness, physical pain, and anger and worry have now reached a record high in the history of our tracking. And you might think, well, that makes a lot of sense. War is breaking out in Ukraine, hunger is rising, and we also find, we just all suffered through a global pandemic. But here's the problem. All 5 of those indicators have been rising for 10 straight years, and it's a massive problem. So as we celebrate International Happiness Day this weekend, let's not forget the amount of people that are unhappy in this world today and do exactly what Danny Kahneman said, which is try to make a better world for those that are unhappy.
John Clifton from pollsters Gallup at the launch of the 2022 World Happiness Report. You can watch the full stream on the YouTube channel of the UN's Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So that's what happened this week, Arion. Why does it matter?
So the World Happiness Report is this annual index of global contentment that's sponsored by the UN, and it's now been going for 10 years, which gives us a good opportunity to start to stop and take stock and think about, what happiness is, what we've been tracking, what the trends are, and, where we're going in terms of what the meaning of this study can be for us to apply internationally, both through governments and as individuals.
Okay, but it sounded almost like it was the Global Unhappiness Report from that clip we heard there. I mean, he was mentioning stress, sadness, physical pain. It doesn't sound like positive statistics.
That's true. So they do both ends of the happiness spectrum, which placed this year Finland as the happiest country for the 5th year in a row, interestingly. And at the bottom end of the list, you've got countries like Afghanistan, perhaps unsurprisingly, and then Lebanon close behind. Though it's worth noting that the list was compiled and finalised before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. But back at the top end, you have Northern Europeans once again dominating those top spots, as they have done for years, with the Danes second to the Finns, followed by the Icelandic, the Swiss and the Dutch all holding those smug top spots. but as you say, it's trying to do both things. It's trying to assess both the top end, what makes people happy in the first place, counterpointed by the bottom end of what drags them back down, what makes people unhappy as well.
Okay, well, let's focus on Finland then. If 5 years in a row, that is kind of amazing. Sorcha, what do you think is their secret? Why do the Scandinavian countries routinely come out as the happiest places to live?
So actually, the New York Times put this question to Finns last year because, as you say, it's won 5 years in a row. And Finns felt there was a variety of reasons, that they are a relatively egalitarian society. People tend not to be too focused on comparing themselves socially. They also said that many people had access to a good education, which helped keep income differences small. And also, interestingly, one other thing they said is that there's really high levels of social trust in the country. So people trust each other, and they also trust their institutions. like doctors and like their police force, which they felt kind of contributed overall to being the happiest country in the world.
Leif, do you trust this data?
I think it's quite useful, but I don't trust it entirely, no, because partly it's a sort of strange mix of different ingredients. There's kind of traditional measurement of how countries are doing economically and whether they're full of war. But then there are also the data draws on studies. And we know that depending on where you are, what kind of language you speak, we mean very different things by happiness. I was looking at a study, an older study that was saying that when we answer the question, are you happy? Apparently about 70% of that answer, we say, yeah, I'm a 9 out of 10, really reflects our mood. And about 30% of the answer reflects a kind of deep state of where we think we're at in our lives. So I'm a little bit skeptical about how we measure happiness. And yet I also think it's quite useful to basically take stock, as Arion said, and look at where people seem to be generally thriving in the world and where they don't seem to be thriving.
So that economic metric you mentioned, Leif, that's actually processed and baked in, is it, to the statistics? So it's not just a question of asking people if they're happy. They just assume if you're in a poor country, you won't score highly on happiness.
Well, yeah. So I think the 6 main variables that are used in the report are income, life expectancy, social support, freedom, trust, and generosity. And somewhere in the mix, happiness sort of measurements kind of comes out of that. It's quite an interesting way of calculating happiness. And some people, critics of this report, who kind of wheeled out every year whenever it drops, say that basically it's quite a kind of Western-centric way of looking at happiness, because it basically puts the countries that are really stable and fairly prosperous usually fairly close to the top of the list.
Yeah, because there's no African countries in the top 50, Arion, and yet, I've visited lots of African countries, and I wouldn't say that all the people that you meet, despite living in poverty, are unhappy.
Yes, I think that's fair, but in defence of at least what they're trying to do, as Leif was saying, they're taking into account all of these sort of factors like GDP and social support and personal freedom and all of that. But they also are doing traditional polling in the form of these Gallup polls. We heard from the Gallup guy at the top of the segment.
Yeah, but it's kind of like they're asking, which society is the most Finnish? And then the answer is Finland.
Finland, yeah. Who knew? Well, that's true. That's true to an extent, except for the fact that they've tried to offset this traditional quest for what happiness used to mean, which was, sort of excitement and feeling, elated and all of that, with a different kind of happiness, which is perhaps more Eastern. We might have regarded it as more Eastern historically. Those things of balance and harmony and, calm and contentedness. And that is something that they actively introduced 3 years ago. I think the first time they did it was in the 2019, or perhaps it was the 2020 census that they gathered. But basically they were looking to analyze not only people's feelings about how much they enjoyed going on roller coasters and the like, but also how calm they were, how balanced and how peaceful they felt. And I think it's easy to see why, particularly in poorer countries, and perhaps this does explain Africa in particular, where calm can tend to be quite low, not least if you're in an actual literal war zone, why they would score poorly in a happiness test that is looking for things like these more sort of, what was historically a sense of, balance and harmony, if those are places that don't have terribly much balance or harmony.
And Israel is in the top 10. That was a surprise to me. It's all Northern European countries, and then you get to Israel, who have had a war this year. Yeah,
they come, I think, number 9. And there's been lots of kind of surprise at that, especially given Israel's occupation of Palestine. And the Palestinian territories were surveyed, and unsurprisingly, they came 104th out of the 156 countries surveyed. And I think that, well, at least looking at the way that the survey or that this report is kind of put together, it's really no surprise to me that Israel scores so highly, because it's a very stable country, even if there's this, obviously the occupation is ongoing. That doesn't affect most citizens. It's got excellent health services and really strong social and family networks. So individuals in Israel probably do have the sense of security and belonging and meaning that this survey seems to give a lot of weight to.
Yeah, and I suppose the government supported people well there during COVID as well, didn't they, Sorcha, which is obviously the background to this particular survey. You know, they were having vaccinations ahead of lots of other countries in Israel, weren't they? But why is it, do you think, that we don't necessarily seem to learn the lessons? You know, we do these surveys and then we say, OK, Finland's the best. But I don't hear people in British government saying, well, let's be more like Finland then. Let's be more like Scandinavia. Let's put our children in school at the age of 6. Let's have better paternity leave. It doesn't seem that these things are necessarily implemented.
I think Scandinavia has a big focus on kind of social cohesion and also looking after each other and looking after people less fortunate themselves. They've got a very strong kind of social security network in Scandinavian countries. And I think in the UK, and possibly our government as well, kind of values that kind of looking after the poorest in society. I'd say slightly less. There's more of an attitude of, you know, you've got to get on and you've got to earn money yourself and you've got to be self-reliant. And I think that kind of, it is just those kind of difference in attitudes that can really explain why we don't follow a Scandinavian model in the UK.
But I think there has been a growth, at least over the last 10 years, at least in interest in happiness. And I think policymakers worldwide are seeing happiness as an overarching objective of public policy. And, you know, for example, with the encouragement from the OECD, nearly all of the member countries now measure the happiness of their people annually. And the European Union asks its member countries to put well-being at the heart of their policy design. And I remember Jacinda Ardern a few years back saying we're not going to go for sort of financial objectives, we're going to measure happiness. And that's going to be the sort of the thing that New Zealand regards as our measure of primary success. So
and they've made the top 10, haven't they?
And they made it into the top 10. So, yeah, so well done them.
So it works. I mean, Sorcha, that's interesting, isn't it? The word happiness. It seems slightly more in the zeitgeist to me than it was perhaps 5 years ago. Maybe people were talking about well-being more, and now it's back onto happiness. What do you think that signifies? Is happiness the new well-being?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I think, obviously, current world events can explain that. I don't think when the world has just experienced a global pandemic, the concept of well-being is particularly helpful because people haven't really been able to ensure their well-being particularly well. And therefore, we've kind of focused, shifted over more towards a sense of happiness and how we can achieve kind of feelings of contentment and happiness. And actually there's an interesting book that's just come out by Dr. Rangan Chatterjee called Core Happiness, and he suggests that happiness is something that's trainable and you can strengthen your happiness over time through these core practices. And those are relatively simple things like picking key values to live by, eliminating choice from your life, treating yourself with respect and compassion, doing activities that put you in a flow state. And I think it's interesting that those are things that you can control yourself. Those are things that you have agency over and doesn't require kind of outside forces. And I think it's obvious why we're kind of moving towards that kind of self-agency in terms of finding happiness, when for the last 2 years we've had no agency over our well-being due to the pandemic and other major global events as well.
It's interesting, isn't it, Leif? Because it seems to me like maybe well-being is now slightly thought of as a kind of middle-class California yoga mat state. Whereas happiness is the thing we can all I mean, one of the things that Chatterjee gives as an example is we can all know what we like on a menu and order the thing we like and not get worried about reading the whole menu. I mean, that sounds very trite, but I mean, it's the kind of small change that anyone can make.
Yeah, I mean, I went through a quite extended phase of having the same thing for dinner every single night, unless I was out, and because it was leeks, hummus, and some mackerel, and because I get to dinner time and I'd think, oh, I shouldn't really have the same thing again, but I'd say to myself, well, that's all that I want, so I guess I'll just have it again. I welcome the shift from well-being to happiness, because well-being over the past few years has been shown up, I think, to be quite narcissistic, and also to be really often a kind of rich white woman's pursuit. That's the kind of cliche, as embodied by maybe Gwyneth Paltrow, who has been the kind of champion for well-being for the past few years. And I think it's maybe slightly less generationally difficult just to talk about happiness. Your gran would know what you mean by happiness, which she might not really understand the term well-being because it's become so slippery. I do think it's probably a little bit more family friendly as a term, happiness rather than well-being.
Well, I am happy to say we'll be moving on to Leaf next after this. Okay, Leaf, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How a strip search laid bare more problems at the Met.
Well, it's absolutely barbaric. Do you know what I mean? It's so barbaric. It's shocking to hear, that in a place, a school that's supposed to be safe for a young woman at the age of 15, do you know what I mean, to be taken out of her safety, taken away from her friends, do you know what I mean? So I think she was sitting an exam and put in a room and strip searched by the police. I mean, I just think that is so barbaric. It cannot happen, do you know what I mean?
A protester called Claire speaking to the Evening Standard on Sunday. Leaf, what was she protesting about and what's happened this week?
Well, she was protesting about the treatment of an unnamed child who's just been called Child Q, who in December 2020 was taken out of an exam, as she said in the clip, and strip searched in her school by a group of police officers who were called by the school to attend to the scene. It was thought that she might have cannabis on her person because teachers had noticed a smell of cannabis, and the people had previously been kind of thought to have had cannabis in the school before. But this girl was treated absolutely appallingly. She was on her period and she was made to strip down naked and bare some of her intimate body parts in the search, which was conducted by two female police officers. And this week, we've seen 2 of the 5 police officers who were involved in the search being removed from frontline duties. So it was announced at a meeting at Hackney Town Hall.
And that meeting was oversubscribed, wasn't it? And had to be moved online because so many members of the public wanted to come to it. So there's been a lot of protest. Do you think that these 2 police officers being taken off frontline duties is the end of the matter? Or do you think there have to be more action because there's been so much protest?
I doubt it's the end of the matter because the child, or at least the lawyers representing the child, have said that she's going to be taking action against both the police and the school. So yes, as you said, this call, there were 250 people on it. It was going to be in person, but then too many people wanted to attend, so it had to move online. At this call, so reports The Guardian, the tensions were running really high. And I don't think that this is going to end until, frankly, strip searching, especially against children, is really got under control.
OK, so on that, Arion, what are the rules and laws around under 16s being strip searched?
Well, actually, I think the age is 17. So anyone over 17 can be strip searched, but people under 17 need to have an appropriate adult present if they're going to be strip searched. And that wasn't the case.
Which wasn't the case.
With Child Q,
yeah.
Exactly. Except in urgent cases where there's a risk of harm, or if the juvenile themselves has specifically said that they don't want an appropriate adult there. But this decision has to be recorded and signed by an appropriate adult. So again, this wasn't something that happened in the case of Child Q.
And the majority of the protesters, Sorcha, clearly feel that the reason, or one of the main reasons that those protocols weren't being followed, is because Child Q is black. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, well, that's certainly what the safeguarding review, which was conducted by Hackney Council, found. It said that racism had been an influencing factor in the decision to undertake the search, as was adultification bias. They said that was a factor too, which is where adults perceive black children as being older than they are. And the panel said it had a firm view that had Child Q not been black, then her experiences was unlikely to have been the same as what happened. And I think also interestingly, at a later police panel meeting, Hackney's basic unit commander, Marcus Bennett, said that the Met does have a problem with viewing children in inner London as adults. And he said that Child Q probably would not have been subjected to a strip search had she been a child living in the Cotswolds, which I think is very interesting statement to make.
It is. Is it necessarily a race thing, though, Leaf, that? Because, I mean, that's inner city versus, countryside, and policing those two areas is very different. And the problems amongst young adults in inner London are vastly different, regardless of what colour you are, in terms of weapons people are carrying, the kind of violence that happens, and the drugs that are circulating.
Yeah, I think that is true. That obviously kids in the Cotswolds are up to different kind of things. They're still committing offences, but possibly different type of offence than you'd see in London. Although in this case, marijuana, I don't see that as desperately city-centric. Kids are smoking dope, whether they're in the country or whether they're in the city. And this review that was conducted, was really quite striking. There were quotes from Child Q's mother, who was saying that, who saw it very much as a kind of racially tinged incident, and the impacts on this girl, can't really be overstated. I think her aunt was saying that she used to be a bubbly, vivacious person, and now she's barely speaking, and she's also scared of police officers apparently, and she doesn't like going on roads, and she also came out in the report, seems to have accrued a reputation as one of the kind of big drug dealers at the school, which is just heartbreaking when you consider that she wasn't even found with any marijuana when this horrific strip search was actually conducted.
And I mean, I must say, having looked into it myself, I can totally understand why people think it was racially motivated. But this is the second time in the past few months, Arion, that we've discussed strip searching of women on this show and the police's attitude to women. And last time we were talking about it was a white woman. So you could argue that maybe the culture of entrenched misogyny in the Met is more to blame than racism, although I suspect it's probably both.
Yeah, I think it is probably both. And I think I think there's a lot of problems that the Met has to address at the moment. And, we've seen Cressida Dick step down recently. And, even just looking at statistics, I found this stat on where strip searching is taking place in the country. And in 2016, the BBC reported that of the 5,000 children in England and Wales that had been strip searched between 2013 and 2015, more than 4,000 of those searches had been conducted by the Met Police. So this is a power that the Met Police themselves are overusing, and particularly against children. So I think that is something that, while the Met is looking at all the other things that it needs to address, it might also want to consider. Why are we doing this, and why are we doing this so much to children?
But, Leif, I mean, you mentioned it was cannabis, and just the very fact that it's cannabis and we know how widespread that is makes this story harder to swallow. But on the principle of drugs, an illegal substance being brought into a school that are disruptive and bad for the children's health, if this was heroin, I don't think there'd have been such an uprising. What do you think the teachers should do? If you were a teacher in a school and you genuinely thought a pupil there had drugs about her person, how should you deal with it? Did they do something wrong in calling the police?
Well, the review said that the teachers didn't do anything wrong by noticing a smell of cannabis and kind of showing curiosity about it. But what was striking about the review, or one of the things that I found striking about the review, was that it said that the teachers saw the child as a risk rather than at risk. Because if you're smelling drugs on a child, there's clearly something going wrong with that child, and she needs to be supported and helped, rather than treated as a sort of criminal in the school and treated as an adult criminal, as seemed to have been the case. It's also worth saying that in this review it said that there were 25 children in 2020 and 2021 who were subjected to further searches like this one in Hackney, and that 15 were black, and nearly all of those searches resulted in no further action, which is to say that the police didn't find anything that was worth taking forward. So although I do see in principle why you might want to strip search someone, say if you think they're hiding a gun, because that would obviously be extremely dangerous, no matter how old they were, it does seem that the cases in which this is actually relevant as a tactic are vanishingly few and far between, and so police should be much more careful about when they deploy it as a tactic, because it's incredibly powerful and life-changing, especially for this girl.
But on the point of what the school should have done, though, if the answer isn't call the police, if the answer is bring them in for a chat with the headmaster, there's a risk, isn't there? This could equally be covered by tabloids as, look at this school in Hackney being soft on drugs.
I think probably that kind of stuff is going on all the time, that teachers are trying to bring family members into conversations about, children that are deemed going through a difficult time, and that those things don't get into the papers. So I don't quite buy your argument that if the school had taken a more pastoral approach to the girl, who, by the way, let's say again, wasn't found with cannabis, that they would have, somehow courted controversy. What they ended up doing was much more kind of controversial. And even in this police meeting that happened on Wednesday night, the police officer himself said that probably the school shouldn't have called the police, and probably the police, when they got there, should have seen that it wasn't an occasion where their presence was warranted. So there were mistakes to be shared by both the school and by the police, seemingly according to this review.
And I think there's also clearly safeguarding issues within the school. I mean, if a teacher phoned the police, which they did in this case, then they should have known that an appropriate adult was required to be present. That didn't happen. And in terms of student well-being, lots of school students are now saying, who have come to these protests, who are from that school, have now said that they don't feel that teachers can keep them safe at school. And I think that's really understandable if you think that your teacher could possibly, be involved in subjecting you to a strip search. I certainly wouldn't want to go to school like that. I wouldn't want to send my children to a school like that. And I think it kind of raises big questions about the protocols that were happening in that school as well, in terms of how teachers are behaving and viewing the children and treating the children as well.
But also aftercare, Arion, because obviously the police went way beyond their brief and behaved badly in this instance. But even if they hadn't, if you took my earlier question as reasonable, that the police should have come in and spoken to this girl, even if there hadn't been a strip search, her not having been found with cannabis on her person, you would think the school would then say something to her to look after. How are you after that experience? Sorry you had to go through that. But according to the victim's mother, she was just shoved back into an exam and never asked how she felt about it.
I think that's part of the hideousness of this story, that she was made to put her clothes on, made to put back on this used sanitary towel, and then sent back into the exam that she'd been yanked out of with no further support that would have helped her to even begin dealing with the problem that she'd just experienced. She was just thrust straight back into her everyday life as if nothing had happened.
I've been trying to work out what exactly happened to Child Q after this horrific search. The review says that she was sent back in a taxi home to her mother, and then she told her mother what had happened. But there are also reports that she actually was returned to the exam from which she'd been pulled out of. So it's a bit unclear about what exactly happened, but what is obviously clear as day is that she was left completely traumatized by this incident.
Okay. A story I'm sure we will return to again. Sorcha, you're up next after this. Okay, Sorcha, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Tokyo students will soon be able to embrace their creative streak.
So it is a well-known fact that there are so many rules about your hair in Japanese schools. You can't have your favorite style of hair. No dyeing, no perm, you can't style it with a hair wax, the length should be less than this and that. But these are somewhat understandable. I mean, I wouldn't say it's understandable, but what they're saying basically is just be as natural as possible. Like, don't do anything to your hair.
YouTuber Shun Chan with his video Japanese School Rules Even Japanese Don't Understand. Sorcha, what's the story?
So, under Tokyo's public school system, Tokyo students have to adhere to a strict dress code. So they have to dye their hair black, they have to wear certain hairstyles, and they even have to wear certain underwear in designated colours in some schools in Tokyo. But from the 1st of April, a lot of these rules are going to be abolished in nearly 200 schools after the Tokyo Board of Education surveyed schools, students and parents about their views on these strict uniform policies.
And how are they being amended?
So the rule changes will include ending regulations on hair colour, underwear colour, a ban on 2-block hairstyles, which is a really popular K-pop hairstyle in Japan at the moment.
Yeah, that's like long on the front, short at the back.
Yeah, exactly. If you've seen any K-pop stars, you'll envision it perfectly what that style is, as well as some other kind of more ambiguous rules, such as guidelines about what is considered to be a behaviour of a typical high school student. So not all schools are going to get rid of these rules. They'll keep some requirements in places, especially over proving that if your hair is curly or not. This is quite a big one in Japan. You often have to show proof that your hair is not naturally dead straight, and you've in the past had to show proof if your hair is not naturally completely black. So some schools are keeping those in place.
I mean, the hair dyeing thing is the particularly bizarre one, isn't it? I think to a Western audience, because I mean, I get that like talking about school children's underwear sounds distasteful, but you could still imagine a British school saying, you know, oh well, when you're playing sport, you must be wearing your yellow sporting knickers. I mean, that sort of thing still does happen, doesn't it? But the hair, I mean, that's not a uniform. That is your actual hair coming out of your head.
Yeah, I think this is definitely the one that's the biggest kind of surprise to Westerners. And in fact, it's become a topic of huge debate in Japan and Tokyo, especially after a few years ago, a high school student in Osaka sued education authorities because her school told her to dye her naturally brown hair or she would be excluded from school. And she kept dyeing it, but then her roots would grow. She'd face academic penalties. Eventually, she said the dye was damaging her hair and her scalp and causing her mental distress. And she actually won damages in compensation from the school board.
So is that the real politique here then, Arion? Sorcha made it sound like this change has come about thanks to some great democratic survey, but actually maybe just the government and the school boards are turning around and saying we can't enforce this stuff anymore.
Partially. I mean, I think it's notable that the court case found that the schools had applied their rules appropriately, but they gave damages to the girl in question, I guess, because of the literal suffering that she'd experienced because she had these problems with her scalp, but also the emotional stuff that she'd gone through because she was excluded from some school camps and so on. But it generated a certain amount of reflection around the country and then this survey to see what people thought. And I think that the results of that contributed to the decision to loosen up some of the rules, at least in Tokyo. But I saw this really interesting bit of commentary from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Board of Education member Kaori Yamaguchi, who said that she hopes that this uniform change will embolden the public to question other obsolete traditions in Japan. She said, Japanese people have been educated to believe that it's a virtue to simply abide by the rules. I hope this will be an opportunity for people to discuss what we should do and create a society where rules are observed in a manner that's convincing to everyone. And I think that's a really interesting and potentially profound shift that could come from this. Is Japan going to loosen up and be less rule-based, less regulation-based in the way that that people come at all social issues, not just school uniforms?
And that's something, Leaf, that expands beyond Japan, isn't it? Because, here in the UK, we still, for example, dress up little boys when they go to school like little businessmen with their ties and their blazers. And it's a particular type of vision of business, isn't it? Where you go to work in an office and you have to dress smartly and impress clients, which isn't not how I'm working. I'm sitting here in a green T-shirt with a NASA space rocket on it. So why is that? Like, why do we have this sense that, people have to dress as children like adults that they may not want to become?
Yeah, I think it's the way, or a way that society is basically endorsing certain approaches to life. So with the little businessmen that we seem to send out to school, the idea is that society wants them to become businessmen when they're older, maybe. In the case of Japan, I suppose what's troubling about this is that the implication is that the right hair color is black, that anything else is not good, and that's the thing that's probably really damaging for students who, don't have jet black hair. And Japan is a remarkably homogenous kind of country in some ways, so it probably doesn't cause that many students a great deal of harm, but it is striking that there being sort of this subliminal messaging is coming through so loud, or has been coming through so loud, that it's good to look a certain way.
I saw a bit of analysis on that by a researcher called Mami Suzuki, who explained on her culture blog Tofugu that the obsession in Japan with black hair is based on this bygone fantasy of what the Japanese image is all about, and jet black hair, or kurokami, evokes this old idealized Japanese woman that was equated with submissiveness and tidiness and cleanliness. And so quite a lot of the idea she was saying was that this is perpetuating an age-old idea of what womanhood was about in Japan. So that was interesting.
And also what girlhood is. I mean, I'm choosing my words carefully here, and I'm not going to direct this question to anyone in particular, so you can chip in if you have something on this. But the Japanese, as a culture, do have a bit of a thing, don't they, about the cute schoolgirl in their popular culture. And, I mean, that seems to me to be about basically what men think little girls should be dressed like.
I found this really interesting article on that on The Guardian that was published in the late 90s that attributed that sexualization of Japanese schoolgirls in particular to two things. First of all, they said the Japanese media had turned the once innocent schoolgirl into a sex object, making these really largely unsubstantiated claims about the availability of underage sex for cash. This was a wild thing that I hadn't clocked. But then the Guardian article went on to say that a small percentage of schoolgirls were said to then be cashing in on this media attention by dabbling in prostitution. Again, had no idea, but that apparently led to this proliferation of magazines devoted to schoolgirl sex, and then these shops and also vending machines that we've heard about specializing in the sale of their used underwear and so on. So it kind of generated this fetish that all started with this furore that emerged from a sort of sexual interest within the Japanese media itself.
I mean, that might be very specifically Japanese, Sorcha, but looking at some of the other changes that are coming about, I saw that a school in Ube has announced that their uniform will be genderless as well. That does seem like something that could be the future for the rest of us too, given that increasingly we're seeing over here a discussion about how non-binary kids feel in their uniforms.
I think it's hard to know. I think in terms of student well-being, and I think even though it might be slightly ironic to say after what we just spoke about, I think in terms of student well-being, I think lots of teachers and lots of schools do view moving towards genderless uniforms as the way forward, especially as more school pupils are exploring their gender identity. I think from my perspective, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and what encourages students to come to school and feel comfortable at school and feel ready to learn, I absolutely would embrace that. I was just saying that my old school introduced genderless uniforms a few years ago, long after I left, and there was a lot of backlash in the tabloid press. So I think there is, on one hand, possibly yes, schools would be happy to move towards embracing that, and on the other hand, there's still a lot of kind of cultural pushback in the UK against the idea that students should be allowed to essentially choose how they want to present at school.
I mean, a lot of it is to do with the convenience of parents, though, isn't it, Leaf? I do think about this now. I'm a parent myself. I mean, I went to a secondary school with no school uniform, and I liked it. But now I've got children, I'm very pleased that I don't have to think every day about what they're wearing. They just have to get in their uniform and I shove them out the door. So I wonder, especially in this world of social media where parents have a voice too and will complain about things at the school, it's that the school uniform changes have to be justifiable.
And the argument has been for school uniforms over the years that it's a way of kind of levelling the playing field, because if there's no school uniform, obviously some kids, the richer ones maybe, will come to school looking really cool in designer garbs, but the rest will might feel a bit inferior as a result. But I also think that even as adults that we tend to reach for our uniforms. I usually wear the same thing to work because I really can't be bothered to expend the energy in the morning. So I think there's something to be said for uniforms being able to remove decision from the day, which as we talked about earlier, Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, the happiness expert, probably thinks is a good thing because it frees up our mind to be able to think about other things that are maybe more conducive to happiness.
Yeah, but some people are happy, Arion, by putting on a jaunty scarf. Adding a bit of colour to what they're wearing, some different socks. That's the thing that makes them happy.
Yeah, it's the sort of sartorial equivalent of not necessarily just reaching for mackerel and leek and hummus at every opportunity. Not that there's anything wrong with that, Leaf. It's not a criticism.
I think there's a lot wrong with it.
I am grateful that you all turned up this week wearing your matching The Week Unwrapped red coats that I insist upon for every recording. My thanks to Arion, Leaf and Sorcha for joining me. We will be back next week. And remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, whatever you're wearing. And remember to check out our sister show, The Overview, from the week as well. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.